We're live. Okay, we're live now.
Well, thank everyone for joining Sovereignty Congress, our very first ever live stream. Apologies for anyone who's attempted to connect with the old link. There were some technical issues there. And we're very grateful to Richard to come to our rescue on this particular issue. It's very kind of you. First of all, I'll hand over to Jacqueline Bruce, who's going to be moderating the discussion today, and I'll let you kick us off and introduce yourself and everyone, and hope everyone enjoys the live stream.
Thanks, David. So I'll start by introducing myself, Jacqueline Bruce. I was born in the Vale of Leven Hospital before it was allowed to become what it is today. Brought up in Dumbarton in a working class family. I was lucky enough to go to university and achieve an honours degree in marketing. I have never been particularly political, viewing it as a pointless waste of time, to be honest. However, the referendum ignited my interest, which quickly waned. In 2020, I discovered the realities of the global monetary system and have subsequently taken a huge interest in geopolitics and the political system, the global monetary system, and how government operates within it, and how Scotland can also possibly prosper within that landscape. I was very active in my local community over the last few years, attempting to affect change via my community council, but I left defeated in 2022 and took up membership of the Sovereignty Party several months ago to check out what the party was all about. So thank you for inviting me on here today, David. I will first of all introduce Ken. Ken Thomson was born in Elderslie, Scotland, lived in Barrhead, then Dunlop in Ayrshire before attending Keele School in my area, Dumbarton. He studied building in Southampton before embarking on a 30-year career in industrial technical textile products. Ken was membership secretary of the Kilmarnock and Loudon Conservative and Unionist Party from 2002 until 2006. He joined UKIP in 2010 and became chairman of Fife and Mid-Scotland UKIP. After several UKIP leadership debacles and self-implosion of the party, he was invited to join the Alliance for Democracy and Freedom under the leadership of Dr. Tek Kong as Scottish coordinator and is now Scottish leader. Recently, he graduated with an MA in Ancient Studies from Glasgow University, focusing on theology, archaeology and psychology. He is a father of 4 children, ages 26, 25, 24 and 8. We also welcome onto the panel Richard Lucas. Richard is the leader of the Scottish Family Party, and that's all we have to say about Richard. And we also welcome David McHutchon, who is the leader of Sovereignty Party, a graduate of the University of St Andrews with a master's degree in Russian studies. David worked previously as an antiquarian bookseller, information resources manager, and was acting head of research for one of the largest educational organisations in Kazakhstan. Currently, David works full-time in the food processing industry, and he lives with his family in Huntly, Aberdeenshire, and is currently in the process of renovating an old house in the Speyside Glenlivet ward in Moray. Thanks for joining us this morning, everyone. So I'm going to start with an overarching view on where things are with Scottish society at the moment. Richard, perhaps you could kick us off?
Yeah, but where do we start with that question? I mean, there are concerns on every front. I think the value system of the Scottish government, which is not just, it's in some ways reflects wider Scottish society, is off the rails in lots of ways. And as time goes on, this is manifesting itself in more and more areas of Scottish life. So it's difficult to name an area of Scottish life where this faulty philosophy, if you like, isn't having a negative effect. And we're going to talk about some of them later on. I mean, so I'll save further comments till we go into the specific issues.
Okay, thank you. Ken, would you like to pick up the sort of overarching theme and give your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, it might be a bit of background noise here in a public space, but yes, I think we're in a real quandary at the moment with the way things are going. Obviously, SNP been leading us in the wrong direction for quite a long time, I think, and things seem to be going from bad to worse. So we're obviously needing some real change, and I see probably the mainstream parties are not really the answer. I think we need to be looking to other groups to pull together to try and get things back on track in the country.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. David?
I would certainly agree. I think there is an extent to which the Scottish Government reflects the values of Scottish society, but I would say on most issues it tends to be far more radical and extreme than ordinary Scots, people that you work alongside, friends and family members. So there's a major disconnect here. And I think really what is needed is political representation for a start. Just political representation that is more in line with the mores of traditional Scottish society. And if we have that, good things will flow from it.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to move on to the first topic area, which is Scotland's fertility rate, which at the moment is at its lowest ever at 1.3, where it needs to be at 2.1 in order for a population to survive and thrive. So going to start off by just saying what's going on, what needs to be done, and how do we begin to improve it? I guess that's 3 questions there. Richard, would you like to kick us off again?
Yeah, certainly. When I got the email about the topics, I think this was called the infertility rate. that was quite amusing. Scotland doesn't have a fertility rate; it has an infertility rate, and it is extremely low. China, with their one-child policy, managed to push their fertility rate down to about 1.56, I think. But Scotland, without a one-child policy, has managed to push it down to the region of 1.3. Just want to see some rough calculations. There are a few ifs and buts, but these are good ballpark figures. In 100 years' time, the total, with no immigration, the total population of Scotland would be well under the population of Edinburgh. In 200 years' time, on current projections, the population of Scotland would be lower than the population of the Western Isles. So, in other words, Scotland is going to be depopulated. It's not going to be a functioning nation if this problem can't be solved. But what can be done about it? Lots of things. Basically, a lot of families would like to have more children. When families are asked when they get to the end of their childbearing stage, how many children would you have liked to have had? They'll often say, 3 or 4. How many did you have? 1 or 2. So as a political parties, we can look at what are the reasons that have resulted in people having fewer children than they actually wanted. If we can take away those barriers, then all to the good. If we add incentives even to encourage families to have more children. But the other fundamental thing at the bottom of this, I think, is culture. Because we've had decades of a culture where the message, particularly to girls and to women, is you can fulfill your potential. You can do great things. You've got amazing possibilities before you. And then when people, particularly young girls, hear about what those possibilities are, it's being an MSP, being a fighter pilot, being a CEO of a company. The idea of celebrating motherhood and parenthood doesn't really come into it. So we've got a very deep-rooted cultural problem as well to overcome. And I think we're going to talk about immigration in a little while, but I think this is going to be tied in. It's all very well to say, we're going to stop immigration. So what? We're just going to disappear. So these 2 issues need to be tackled in tandem. One last little snippet as well might be interesting. The fertility rate in Edinburgh is under 1. And in Scotland overall, the fertility rate is significantly higher in deprived areas than it is in wealthier areas. So that might be a pointer to some of the solutions to this as well. So I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Ken, same question to you.
Yep, I think Richard's entirely correct there. We've got some serious societal issues, governmental policy issues, which have been really quite anti-family orientated, I think, for quite a long time. And that's something which really needs to change. But one of the biggest areas I see as a problem is the economics, just the economic situation in Scotland, where prospects are not good and people setting out to start families, it's a daunting prospect to try and keep up with the cost of living is obviously a problem. But we also have a shifting cultural situation where the family is something which is just not champions. There's all sorts of propaganda out there which is really anti-family, and it's really as if it's a deliberate policy to assist in depopulation of Scotland, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It certainly does seem, if I can chip in, that there's almost been an attack on motherhood, and women being at home. David, would you like to pick up on what your thoughts are?
Yeah, I would certainly back up what the other two speakers have said. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think that people don't really realize, it's a little bit like compound interest, just how quickly, as Richard was illustrating, a total fertility rate of 1.3 actually can shrink a population. So if you're looking at, for instance, it would be live births to Scots. I think last year it was around 5,500. That would drop with subsequent generations to 15, 10, 6,500. That's where you get those precipitous falls in population. I think it has to be understood in the context of several things. Globally, there's a decline in fertility rates. Pretty much no country worldwide is unaffected by this. But the charge is really being led by advanced, technologically advanced and economically advanced economies. So for instance, if you look at Korea and Japan, they have some of the lowest birth rates in the world at the moment, well below 1. And that to me is interesting. We've spoken a little bit about economic impact, cultural impact. I think technology partly is playing a role. It's playing a role in a couple of senses. So it's being used to shape attitudes, very much creating a sort of anti-family culture. Family has a sort of cringe factor to it, and it is always the case when you see families being portrayed in soap operas, for instance, and in films and in dramas. Family is portrayed extremely negatively as a place of arguing and fights, and I think that feeds into the way that people view their own families. I think a lot of even families that are together in a lot of ways are actually really dysfunctional. People don't have an attitude of giving of themselves, and technology and specifically mass media and mass culture have a major role to play in that. But technology also provides for entertainment and companionship and a number of things that people would traditionally have got from family, and is acting as a substitute for those crucial relationships. But of course, it's a paper-thin substitute. Technology is not going to be there for you in your hour of need. It's not going to be your companion in your old age. And technology can keep distant family members apart, but it is done more, perhaps, to alienate us from each other than I think we realize. So,
Yeah. Just to sort of follow up on that, do you think there's any sort of glimmer of hope on that in the near future, or is this a really massive task to try and tackle? David, do you want to just start with you again on that one?
I think I would say on so what are the levers that government actually has? If you are looking at the Scottish government and their values and priorities, on the one hand, on the economic front, there is actually quite a bit of support for families at the moment. The Scottish Child Payment can be a significant contributor to family income, particularly for larger families. So I don't think necessarily that on the economic side that is where there's major work to be done. I think where the work is to be done is changing attitudes in the education system, changing attitudes towards family that is coming through in the messaging in the NHS and the healthcare system. It's really interesting the attitude even of some working in midwifery and nursing towards large families. And we have a large family ourselves, I'm father of 6. And there's surprise sometimes when people hear that, but there's also, I think, this attitude of, well, you'll be done now. And we've heard that since, like, we've had 3. So it's definitely the case that, and that's a bit of a generalization. It's not universally been the case, and a lot of it will depend on the individual health practitioners. But there is something of an anti-family attitude even within the healthcare system. So that's something that is within the gift of government to start addressing. But also, I would say, getting rid of some of the legislation that undermines families, and we can all think of different pieces of legislation that have come through the Scottish Parliament in recent years, that would go a long way to redressing the balance.
Yep. Richard, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree about the education issue. In the Scottish education system, pregnancy is presented as a danger. The mission is to avoid this negative outcome. And if you're unsuccessful in avoiding it, don't worry. We can sort that out later. In terms of the demographics as well, I said 200 years time, 22,000 people in Scotland. In the absence of abortion, that would be 1,300,000, because more than a quarter of pregnancies end in abortion. That's a massive factor in the fertility rate. In terms of other policies to promote fertility, I think marriage is a key factor. When people get married, they often feel like, right, we're now in the right context to have children, and they go ahead and have children. So promoting marriage is key. I mean, for our policies, council tax, I think, penalises people who need a big house. Who needs a big house? People with lots of kids. So that's one problem. Childcare, the assumption is that parents want to farm their children out to state childcare at the earliest opportunity for as many hours as possible. We want to say, well, what if they don't want that? Let them have the cash. Instead, transferable tax allowance is an obvious one. Child benefit. I mean, in other countries, I understand in France, you get an extra half a tax allowance for every dependent child in the home. Now, as a small party, it could be tempting just to make up this great list of giveaways for families. So we try and resist that. But I think these are all things that need to be seriously looked at. And I think the justice of it is that currently we've got a generation who tended not to have many children, and yet now in retirement, they're expecting, we're going to get the NHS going to be paid for, our care is going to be paid for, the nation's going to run as it did, even though this generation collectively didn't have sufficient children to maintain that. So I think in the future, this is going to be balanced out, because if people have children, they're effectively taking the step necessary to pay for their care and healthcare, whatever, in the future. So I think tax breaks and advances for people who are having children, even at the expense of people who, for whatever reason, don't have children, I think it's perfectly justified. And that's the direction we need to be heading in.
Thank you. Ken?
Yeah, I would agree with Richard that we need to take some affirmative action to redress the situation and move things forward and try and save the situation. I do wonder, though, David was saying that he thinks it's within the gift of the government to make these changes, to make things happen. But I do wonder at times how much of it is coming down from global diktat to our politicians who are potentially captured and not really working in the interests of our families and moving the forward in that way. So it's difficult. I feel that it feels like there's a real capture of our political class, and they're not really willing or able to address situations in a positive way for whatever reason. Not sure why, but it seems to be a current theme running through all sorts of policies, and very much one of the population decline. So that's I think that's something we need to consider, and I think all the mainstream parties are in that situation, and therefore it's not easy for them to maybe change things in the way that we might wish to, but that's something we're really going to have to deal with if we're going to survive as a country, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, moving on then to something that's been touched upon during that conversation is the ageing population, which isn't going to help matters. What is the future looking like for younger generations who are going to have to pay for this ageing population? How can we look after our elderly people and not burden future generations? Ken, do you want to start us this time?
Yep, ageing populations. Certainly, yep, it's a large symptom of the fact that we're not producing new children. I think in the 1860s we were up about 45 children per head of population, when the head population was around about 3 million. It's now sitting at just over 5 million, I think, in Scotland, and we've got a situation where we've got about 7 children per thousand per head of population, and I think, and also the abortion rate is something like 2.5 to 3 per thousand head of population. So that, I think, probably gives a fairly strong indication as to why we're heading into this area where we've got a much older population, and which means obviously that schools are going to be under threat of closure as well if there's no change to the situation. Yeah, that's where we are now.
Yeah, thank you. David, would you like to?
I don't think if you're thinking about public policy, I don't think it's a good starting point to say, how can we maximize the wealth of a particular segment within society. I think you have to look at society as a whole. If your vision is for family and in the broadest sense, then we should view households and families and extended families as self-supporting networks, because it is more than just what is best for me in my particular age and my particular stage and my particular demographic. So I'm very, very nervous about policy that is led by the aging population narrative. Particularly if you notice, for instance, the publications that repeat it most. And you actually touched on something, Ken, that's quite interesting. If you do have an aging population, that means there's savings that can be made in terms of the number of children that are having to go through the education system, for instance. I know that the economic impact of that is not as great as end-of-life care, but I think that in the resources will always be found to provide for those who are pre-working age or post-working age. Societies have done this for millennia. I think it's just a case of being willing to make difficult changes, some sacrifices, but making sure that there is sufficient provision for all, and cutting your cloth accordingly. So personally, I don't view it as a crisis, but where you could get into difficulties is if there's a rapid uptick in the fertility rate, and then you could have two dependent classes that are quite large. But I think you cross that bridge when you come to it.
Great, thank you. Richard, what's your thoughts?
I maybe wouldn't be quite so optimistic as David. I think the problems in caring for the elderly, basically the standard of care, healthcare and social care that we've come to expect in our society are going to be difficult, if not impossible, to maintain. Having said that, there's lots of countries that don't have these standards, and one way or another, organizations, individuals, families do step into the breach. But the problem, basically, for example, the National Insurance Scheme in the UK is run as a Ponzi scheme. People pay into it as though they were investing that money and that was going to be available then for them when they've retired. That's the way it's sort of conceptually seen. But it isn't that. The government takes the national insurance payments of people now and treats it like, just spends it straight away, spends it on the needs of the moment. And that's why the system's very sensitive to fluctuations in population. Obviously, how do you get back to it? But ultimately, the mistake shouldn't have been made. We should always had a system where you pay into national insurance, that's invested, ready to pay the expenses for that generation. So a big generation has a bigger pot of money invested available to pay for its own needs. But the government didn't follow that basic principle. I think assisted suicide is relevant here. When governments start saying, oh, we've got a problem, they will become increasingly keen to say, okay, well, here's a solution to it. This can help. I think we might have assisted suicide introduced before too long. The last thing I'd say, I think the care issue with an aging population is a very important one. Another one as well is the sort of innovation issue. But when you've got a younger population, they tend to be more full of ideas, throwing themselves into new projects, start new companies, innovation. As people get older, that tends to happen less. And so the dynamism within the economy will really reduce quite dramatically. And that's another very significant factor that I think Scotland and the UK will be facing in the decades to come.
Certainly, and whilst we're on that subject, something quite topical at the moment in terms of care, in a way, I guess, is the winter fuel payments, which has been a hot topic. And whilst it seems like a good idea to be offering winter fuel payments to the elderly, isn't there perhaps bigger conversations to be had around monopolies in the energy sector and expensive green energy and potentially government-owned energy? Do you have any thoughts on that, Richard? We'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think the winter fuel payments, I think, seeing the Conservatives jumping on this, saying it's appalling, I'm not sure it's really so much a matter of principle. I mean, this is maybe a pretty trivial anecdote. But my mother and father are not short of money. And they used to get the winter fuel payment. And my dad used to joke about it, that the government's like sending them a bit of money so they don't get too cold over the winter. So I think in many cases, this was a payment that was made to people who really did not need it at all. So I think to some degree, there's a lot of opportunity in trying to make political capital out of it. But the overall cost of energy, as you say quite rightly, is a much more fundamental issue. And the way this is presented by a lot of the mainstream parties, it's as though you can have your cake and eat it. We're going to go green and it's going to be cheaper. So it's better for everyone. Who could possibly complain? But that's just dishonest. Basically, you can go green, but the reason the energy companies are not going green without any help from the government is because it's not cheaper. It is actually overall more expensive. So I guess the one thing I'd say with that is I just wish that the politicians would be honest. They'd say, we've decided climate change is a very big issue. This is what we think we need to do. This is how much it's going to cost you. Then at least it's honest. But I don't think I've ever heard a politician taking a line like that.
No, neither have I. David, would you like to give your thoughts on that, please?
Well, I think this is one area where you see the incredible potential of Scotland to be a leader is in energy production. And we could be sitting at a situation at the moment where we had a sovereign wealth fund, a little bit like Norway. And you can talk about whether there are negative social consequences that come from having that much essentially accumulated wealth within your state. But they're in a far better position economically than we are. And we are a very energy-rich country, despite the efforts of the SNP government to ban new coal developments, ban new nuclear. They've got effectively a moratorium on new oil and gas exploration and development. They seem to look at the vast majority of sources of energy that Scotland could be prospering from and say, no, let's ban it. It's the ban government. And that is in itself a huge missed opportunity, I think, to fully realize the benefit of our natural resources. Then independence is the way to go. And I think you could find under those circumstances that some of the issues that we're looking at surrounding an aging population could be resolved from what the likes of Joseph Dainter called energy subsidy. So that would be something that I would see as self-evident. Others might disagree, but I do strongly believe that the resources are there. The impediments to exploiting those resources, to benefiting from them, are all political. They are to be found in Westminster and in Holyrood, and we need a change of team in Holyrood for sure. And I would say it's time to get out of Westminster.
Fair enough. Thanks for that. So Ken has dropped off, unfortunately, so we'll move on to the next topic area, which again links in with the earlier conversation around the fertility rate. And moving on to mass migration now, it seems to me like it's a humanitarian issue. We seem to pay for the wars that displace people from their homelands. Their families are being split, trafficking is rife, cartels are exploiting humans as capital, and children are going missing and are abused en route to the USA, for instance. And I have no doubt that it's happening everywhere, including our own shores. And women are also being used and abused. And I even heard a story recently about women being thrown out of vans in Glasgow. And there's pockets of Glasgow which are drowning in victims of this system. Young men hurtling around Glasgow on bikes, delivering food in all kinds of weathers. And how did we get here? How did we get to this situation? It seems like it's been a bit of a boiling frog scenario. What are your views on this, Richard? Can you give us some insight?
Yeah, there's so much to say on this issue. I'll pick a few points. I think it's really strange we've ended up in this situation with a level of immigration that really the general public is not at all happy with, and yet it's carried on regardless. I mean, how that managed to happen is quite difficult to explain. I think illegal immigration, obviously, I just think, whatever it takes, it needs to be stopped. It's understandable that there's very severe public concern about that. I think the nature of immigration into Britain, a substantial amount of it, particularly illegal immigration, it's a family sits down in a poor nation, and the best investment opportunity available to them is to spend their resources. They're quite rich relative to their peers in their nation, to spend their resources on getting their young 18-year-old son to Britain, to go there to work for a couple of years and to send money back, and then to come home at some point. And that's the best investment available to them by a long way. That could earn them a life-changing sum of money in their home environment. And so for many families, that's the investment they choose to make. So they find some illegal gang to try and smuggle son over to a country like Britain, and that's the way it goes. That's why I think a lot of these people who are sent, it is relatively young males, because they're the ones the family selected to go and make their fortune, basically. Now, the spirit behind that, the entrepreneurial spirit or whatever, we could admire that and understand that. But I think a nation does have a right to decide who comes and does not come into its territory. And I think at the moment that has not been properly enforced. I think with immigration that there's the issue of sheer numbers. I mean, are we overcrowded in these islands? In Scotland, I would say certainly not. There's the integration issue, which I think that depends on the scale and of the immigration. I think if you have immigration into a sort of diaspora community, where a community grows, where they're all from the same country, they speak the same language, same religion, and then people look at that and think, well, if I move to Scotland, I can just go and join all my relatives there. They still speak the home language. This is not really going to be a big deal. It's hardly going to feel like going to a new country. It'll just be feeling like, the weather might not be so great, but it won't be too different for being at home. But I'll get paid 10 times as much for the work I do. And people will look at that and think, yeah, that's a good deal. I'm going to do that. Then the bigger these communities grow, the lower the barrier for other people considering moving to, say, Scotland. So the rate of immigration accelerates and accelerates. But in that situation, the rate of integration goes down and down, because you've got communities that are maintaining their own culture. People are coming into them without the expectation of integrating. They're thinking, this is a group of people, speak my language, I'm going to just be in my own culture, and that's unhealthy. And I think it's just an unfortunate part of human nature, the way you've got two groups side by side who don't interact with each other as fully as they might do. Tensions tend to arise. Now, we may say, that's really unfortunate. Why can't people just get over that? But there's no point complaining about human nature. It's the way things happen, problems emerge when you've got these groups next to each other. I think Islam is a concern in some ways. I think lots of Muslims are great citizens, but there's a significant proportion of Muslims as well who, based on their belief system, don't want to participate in a liberal democracy. They're not interested in the sort of fundamental rights, etc., that we enjoy in this country. Then if you get a group in your nation whose priority is, we don't want democracy, we want a different system, we want some sort of religious rule, that's the sort of issue that can't be resolved democratically. Because that's either they have the power and get their way, or the other side has the power and gets their way. And so once you're into that situation, democracy starts to break down, because some issues are so fundamental that you can't decide them by electing parties into the parliament and they'll reach a compromise. So I think there are significant concerns, particularly in England, but they could develop in Scotland as well. And the other, as I say, with immigration, is like the Reform Party saying zero net immigration or whatever, more or less. Okay, so is the nation basically going to fade away then? This has to be seen in conjunction with the ability of the population to reproduce itself as well. But just to conclude, I'd say I do believe that a nation has the right to decide who can come into it and how long they can stay. They've got a complete freedom to make those decisions, to only let in the people of the type or whatever the characteristics that they want. And I think that decision-making power should be exercised more discerningly for Britain.
Thanks, Richard. David, would you like to pick up on that one?
Yeah, I feel like conversations, just picking up on something you said, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said there, but I feel like if you start getting into things like type and characteristics, it can lead you down a bit of a rabbit hole. And you see this with the Conservatives grappling with the immigration issue hopelessly and trying to reduce it very much to an economic issue. So a good indicator that someone might be a good type of person is that they're earning £38,700 a year. That shows that they're hardworking and so on. But there's so much more that goes into what makes up a people than the amount that you're earning. I think none of us would struggle to think of folks that earn a lot of money that we wouldn't want living next door to us. And I really think there's a way of thinking about immigration that is, again, not like reform, where it's all about the numbers. They just view it as a numbers game. If we get to net zero, then the population will stop growing, and all this pressure that we've had on real wages, the pressure on the housing system and infrastructure and the healthcare system, all of that will go away because we will finally have turned off the immigration tap. Let's have a look at this positively and think, what does integration actually involve? You can't go about integrating by having them watching the BBC for 20 hours a week. Integration happens, I think, pretty much exclusively in a family context. And so that's why some of our most successful immigration stories have often been when someone has married a Scot, when you have the assimilation, acculturation happening in the context of a family. Nations are like families. They've always had fuzzy edges, people coming in and going out of it, and yet retaining that core identity. And I think that keeping the door open to that is actually really important. Similarly, immigration from the Scottish diaspora, I'm thinking here ahead to an independent Scotland, would be something that I would support absolutely. People through an accident of history have ended up in countries around the world that may at some future point not consider them to be their own. We have to be aware, as you said, of the realities of human nature, the fact that there is still that tribal element deep inside of most of us. However, people think that they're egalitarian liberals and they've outgrown all of this baseness for themselves. I think you see it re-emerging, and you see it re-emerging often in times of crisis. So to retain an open door to the Scottish diaspora, I think, is something that is essential for humanitarian reasons. In terms of forms of immigration, sorry, that I'm very, very skeptical of. In the first instance, I would say it's the chain migration that you spoke of, where essentially you're having whole communities being transplanted into parts of Scotland, and particularly in a very significant way into parts of the north of England as well. And you've seen total cultural shift there, whole towns that now have an entirely different culture. And I think fundamentally that's unfair to both populations. I think it's unfair to the people who live in those communities. It's their historic county, it's their homeland that is currently become, some have said, like a foreign country to them. But it's also unfair to many places in the global south who are losing most entrepreneurial youngsters, maybe they're most educated, those that have rare and unusual skills that their economies need. Their future lifeblood. And it's interesting, you know, there's been a lot of immigration, for instance, from Turkey into Europe. When no one has spoken about the impact of that on Turkey itself, which is seeing, as most Western European nations are doing, plummeting birth rates. So there is an impact for them, for Turks in the home country. So I think that chain migration is a major issue, but also economic migration. If you're going to have economic migration, the only way that you can get it to work is by separating out citizenship from residency. So you see this, for instance, in the United Arab Emirates, which allows guest workers from all over the world to come and settle there for a time to work and make a shed load of money, you know, off the back of Dubai's oil wealth, but is never offered as a route to citizenship. So citizenship is kept for Emiratis. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that approach. It maybe allows the Emirates to get the best of both worlds. And I think we need to make the move from jus soli to jus sanguine as well, to change immigration law so that it's not simply about residency, you know, and residency offering a path to citizenship practically automatically, because that's where we're at the moment.
Thanks, David. Ken, good to see you back in. We're just talking about mass migration, and I won't say the big question that I asked when you weren't here, but could you just give us your thoughts on? I'd sort of briefly said that mass migration is a humanitarian issue, and we're just getting thoughts on what where you are with that topic.
Yes, sorry about the technical hitch there. We definitely have a problem in the UK with high migration levels, and we seem to have quite high levels of immigration as well. Obviously, the illegal migrant situation is something which is really quite unjustifiable, I think, and I think there's a lot of financial benefits to certain individuals, certain companies, certain groups who are handling all of this and really making a lot of money. So it's driven by money, by profits for certain companies. Obviously, there's also large corporations who encourage lots of migrants because they can have a high turnover of staff to get the absolute best out of them and also keep wages low. So that's certainly a problem, and the Tories for years have talked about sorting it out and done absolutely nothing about it. And the Labour Party now just seem to be, saying they're going to do something about it, but I don't think they ever will. There was the Rwanda policy, which again I always thought was a bit of a red herring, and just to divert attention to keep people thinking there was something being done when there was nothing being done. And again, I think it's a situation where, our politicians have been captured by large corporate bodies, so-called philanthropists, which are not very philanthropic. Again, they seem to be acting in their own interest and trying to really to damage our society, or they don't care about our society and our culture. But legal migration also is something that probably needs a bit of a revamp. We need to look at that and ensure that we are bringing in the best people, like Australia did, some time ago, maybe even still do. They're seeking, young families to come to their country and help their economy, grow their nation, and that's something that we should be doing in Scotland. Recently, I think the Home Secretary is talking about devolving immigration policy to Scotland. And I think that's quite a dangerous thing, because I don't think our government, the SNP, really have a clue what's good for Scotland or what's good for Scots. But that would be an opportunity, obviously, to set our own migration, because it's quite different in Scotland than it is in England. And we need immigration, but we need good, positive, high-quality immigration, where we're bringing in skills, we're bringing in wealth, who can help drive our economy forward, and build Scotland, and really ideally make it an economic powerhouse, which would give us an opportunity to take the country forward.
Perfect, thank
But,
you.
yeah, definitely some serious issues that need sorting out.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ken. So we've got about 14 minutes left. So the sort of final topic we're going to look at is the justice system, and there's been a bit of a focus on two-tier policing, which seems to have taken a little bit of a backseat now. I haven't seen much about it, but the justice system itself certainly appears to be letting people off lightly who shouldn't be, and coming down heavily on those who don't deserve it. I recently heard an anecdotal story about Pullman Prison, who's seen a few suicides recently of young people who just shouldn't have been there, including a young woman in her teens. Where do you stand on the current situation, and what would be your remedy? Richard, we'll go to you first.
Thank you. I think that the two-tier policing issue is very real. I think some of the stories that circulate, it's not the full picture. I think sometimes you get half the story and it sounds really outrageous. But if you look into it in more detail, it maybe is a bit more reasonable. But there is two-tier policing. The police are politicized, the justice system as well. They know which side they're supposed to be on. So that is a serious problem. I think in Scotland, the problem at the heart of the justice system is it's based on a sort of humanist ideology. The idea is that people are basically good. So if someone does something bad, it's not really their fault. It's just they must have had some negative experience. They must have had some tough upbringing or something. So for some unfortunate collection of occurrences in their life up to this point, that's what led them to be criminals. So in the light of that, what they need is some therapy and support in order to deal with these issues from the past, and then they'll be on the straight and narrow. But that's not my experience of being me. My experience has been me is sometimes I think, right, that's the wrong thing, but actually I would like to do it because I benefit from it. And I know they're the sort of decisions that we face. But on this other view, personal responsibility is really diminished. But in Scotland, they say you're not really fully responsible for your actions until you're 25, until your brain's fully developed. Well, I think it goes further than that. They don't actually, at the heart of it, when push comes to shove, they don't actually believe that anybody is responsible for their actions. So that's why we're drifting in that direction. So there's that philosophy. Then another philosophy that's quite damaging to the Scottish justice system is the sort of feminist push as well. Constant push for special treatment for women. Everything has to be seen as gendered. The new women's prison that's opened recently, very many women are special. Women need a more therapeutic, supportive environment in prison. They need a small prison. They need more counsel. I mean, do men not need these things as well? Probably. So there's a push, but rather than seeing, right, what's right and wrong, who are the criminals, who are the victims, what does justice say a person deserves, there's a really strong influence as well of people coming in and saying, well, we're on the side of women. So when women are victims, we've got to make that an especially serious crime. When women are the perpetrators, we've got to see that as well as there must have been something that caused them to do it. It's sort of not really their fault. So if you look at the police, what do the police focus on in Scotland? 3 things basically. Sexual assault, absolutely very serious crime, should be taken very seriously. But Police Scotland, that's like a top priority. Domestic abuse. Why is that? Because it generally tends to be women victims in many cases, and hate crime. They're their 3 priorities. If you go to the Police Scotland website to report that someone's punched you when you're walking along the street, you'll find a hard job to find out how to report that on the website. If it's sexual assault, domestic abuse, or a hate crime, then it's there on the front page. You can click the links, you can make your report. They're basically saying, tell us about these crimes and other crimes we're not so interested in. So I think it's just outright blatant politicization of the police. And I think it is undermining confidence in the police. It's wasting police resources, and it's also undermining confidence in police. So I think there are some things that need to be fixed pretty urgently.
Okay. Why do you think there is that? Why do you think they're focusing on those crimes? What's the...
It's just in line with the political agenda of the SNP. It's generally a sort of left, people of a left progressive ideology. They tend to see things in terms of who's the oppressor group, who's the oppressed group. So we need to be on the side of the oppressed group. So, I mean, I could talk about race as well with the police, like Police Scotland chief saying that Police Scotland's institutionally racist, which is total nonsense. So instead of looking at it the way they should, who are the criminals? Who are the victims? What do we need to do to stop the criminals committing the crime? How do we find them? How should they be punished? It's more about, well, there's these different groups. We need to be on the side of the marginalized groups, because that's the route to a fairer Scotland. So people of minority race, women, LGBT, then we need to have a particular focus on crimes committed by these people. Not committed against these people. When these people are the people committing the crimes, well, we need to be a bit more understanding, because we know that they're the oppressed group, so it's sort of understandable what's happening. So as I said at the beginning, it's a faulty ideology that's influencing the justice system and making it not a justice system. It's bringing in other considerations than justice.
Okay, so it's identity politics is seeping into identity crime almost, what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Ken, would you like to pick up on that?
Yes, I agree with Richard that there is a focus all around these type of incidents, and it seems that normal crime is very much often ignored, and in a sense, in the justice system, justice I think sometimes is ignored as well. One case in point very close to my own heart is the family courts, and how the sort of institutional bias there towards fatherhood, and that's been an issue in my part for quite some years. Where it's very, very difficult to actually, if you've got a broken relationship, it's very difficult to maintain a relationship with your children. And I think that's something which really needs to be completely redressed, because fathers are every bit as important in the parenthood as mothers, and that's not recognised. And it seems to be that you're discriminated against almost immediately as soon as there's a relationship breakdown. The mother is is championed, and you're immediately discriminated against. So that's a problem. And again, when it comes to policing and social services, they're all backing up that kind of narrative. There's thousands of men throughout the country who are cut out of their children's lives completely unnecessarily and completely wrongly, and basically because there's been irreconcilable differences, and the system very much works in the mother's favour. And not only that, but there's also the fathers who are able to cut out the mothers out of their children's lives, which I think is a big issue which really needs to be dealt with and sorted out. To my mind, in other countries, the presumption of 50-50 shared care would be the solution. And on policing, I think the Scottish Police, are faring a little bit better in some areas than the Met Police, for example, where there's definitely a very much bias along racial prejudices grounds. Certainly, a recent demonstration that was in Glasgow, George Square, the police did an absolutely excellent job of keeping the two sides apart, and to be commended, really. So there's good policing here. You know, maybe England could take some examples from as well.
Okay, thank you. David, would you like to give your thoughts?
Yeah, so try not to repeat some of the things that have been said. I think it's really important to look at the culture in our prisons as well. So Scotland has, I believe, the highest level of prisoners on remand as a percentage of the total prison population. We have one of Europe's highest prisoner suicide rates, and we have huge issues with physical and sexual assault in prisons, which is something that's almost never spoken about politically because it's very awkward for folk. But certainly, you know, I've worked in factories since coming back to Scotland. I've worked with ex-cons as well. I know that there are real issues there about protecting prisoners from other prisoners, avoiding brutalization through the prison system, and that's laying the seeds of future family dysfunctionality and future crime and so on. So certainly prison is not an environment where people are being rehabilitated, and it's not serving that function. It serves a deterrence function, but not in the way that we think. And we're going after very often people with these petty laws around about offence, you know, offensive speech, hate speech, and so on. It's exactly the wrong sort of folk that are being sent to prison because of the legal system and what we've chosen to censor. I think another way of viewing what's happening with the criminal justice system is a move away from that old principle of justice being blind, equal justice for all. And as soon as you start making exceptions, as Richard was saying, for different groups based upon different inherent characteristics and having different standards for different communities, you have lost that principle. And once you lose that principle, trust very, very quickly evaporates away from the criminal justice system as a whole. So the whole thing needs root and branch reform. We've not even begun to speak about all the issues to do with transgenderism in jails, it being used as a way of, by men essentially, of avoiding being sent to a male prison, and the impact that that has had on women prisoners. So I think getting back to basics in prisons, certainly getting that remand rate down is critically important. This is an extraordinary number of people that that don't actually have to serve a custodial sentence after they come off of remand, because either they were found to be innocent, or the sentence that they were given was actually, they served their time already, and so the time served is counting and allowed them to be released straight from court. It's a crazy situation to be in. We're working under the principle, it seems, here in Scotland, of guilty until proven innocent, and that really needs to change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I think that takes us up to the end. David, would you like to, or are you finishing off?
Yeah, first of all, I thank you very much, Jacqueline, for your moderation of the panel and for such interesting questions, and hopefully our answers have done you proud in some small way. Richard and Ken, thank you so much for joining with us, and it's really fascinating to have a conversation like this. I think in politics it's very easy sometimes to find the differences, but it's interesting to see all the areas, I think, where we do look at the world similarly as well. So thank you for your time. I would just like to make one final plug. If you are new to Sovereignty, if you've never come across us before, go to the sovereignty.scot website. You can find out a little bit about the party there. This event is happening in the context of our Congress 2024, so we would encourage you to join and donate. And I'm sure the Scottish Family Party equally would be happy for you to check out them as well. What we'll do is we'll put the links to each of the party websites into the description of the live stream after we edit it later to allow you to find out more. And so thank you very much for your time as well in the audience, for joining us today. We really appreciate that.